Hello and welcome to my presentation, The Kid in Me, Magic Lost in the 5 Themes and Discovery of the Innocent Other in Children's Literature. These are my children. They're very special to me. Whenever I think about my children and the experiences I've witnessed them growing up, I often think about my own childhood, something that we all tend to forget as adults. Childhood is truly a magical time, a time that is filled with innocence, imagination, excitement, wonder, and fear. I've read a lot of children's books when I was a child, and it was a lot of fun thinking about these wonderful fairy tales with a happy ending, stories about animals that can talk, characters that can fly, but I never really got the allegorical messages behind these books, however, simply because I was a child looking for adventure. Couple of important questions to consider. When does childhood begin and end? Are children filled with sin, or are they naturally innocent? To answer the first question, I believe that children are innocent, and I do believe that childhood begin and end, personally, when it's up to the child, and only a child will know when that magic spell is forever lifted. The answer to the second question, we'll get to that later as we progress in this presentation. To get the presentation going, the most important book of all opened things up for me, a real marvel and a great appreciation for understanding children's literature in the books I've read, Feeling Like a Kid by Jerry Griswold. And it is here where he talks about the important themes in popular and classic works of children's literature: snugness, scariness, smallness, lightness, and aliveness. Each of these important themes exhibit a certain appeal to young people and simultaneously guides adults in understanding the psyche of children. Other important works like I Was a Rat, Where the Wild Things Are, and Charlotte's Web will be used as a guide to support these important themes and an explanation on how innocent children are affected and often othered because of the important use of their magical space. Let's begin with snugness. According to Griswold, snugness. Children like to play underneath tables, make tents from blankets and chairs. This is an activity common among the young but no longer seen in adulthood. That same sought-after pleasure also appears in children's books in their frequent and pleasing visions of the snug place. An example of snugness is in E.B. White's Charlotte's Web, when Fern would take her doll for a walk in the doll carriage with Wilbur following her. Whenever Wilbur got tired of walking, Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage alongside the doll. If he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. Another example of snugness can be found in Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, where he's wearing a wolf costume, making his cozy fort of his own while making mischief of his own. For instance, this pictured stuffed animal hanging from a wire hanger. I think it's fair to say that this snugness sensation, from a psychological perspective, is an attempt to recapture the security of the womb. Moving on to scariness. According to Griswold, adults, in my experience, don't like to have pointed out to them that childhood is a very scary time and the world of children's literature a very scary place. Forgetting their own childhoods, many grown-ups prefer a sentimental notion of childhood, where happy youngsters inhabit a trouble-free country and the sun is always shining. In Philip Pullman's I Was a Rat, a scary moment occurred when Roger, who was a rat, who is innocent, is considered to be a monster and is condemned, locked up in a cage like an animal and naked for the world to see, waiting to be exterminated. Even with innocence, Roger is quite aware of the danger he is facing. I enjoyed this book because I just love the way Pullman magically weaves fairy tale, humor, and adventure in a delightful and witty parody of the press way. It has a little bit of Perrault and a lot of Dickens, and I think you will enjoy this book, and I recommend it. Another example of scariness in a fun way is shown in Where the Wild Things Are, where Max is imagining himself traveling at sea, where he stumbles across these wild things and tames them by doing a magic trick by just saying, "Be still." From a psychological perspective, Griswold argues that from the very earliest age, when adults play the game of boo with infants, the young learn the surprising fact that scariness can be a discomforting fun. In response to Griswold's quote about scariness, in my experience, I believe that adults are sometimes not the best judges of what children find too scary, too upsetting, or disturbing. I believe that each child has their own limits, of course, but a little scariness can be stimulating both intellectually and emotionally. Even Max, my son, or any child can make any situation scary in a fun way by being creative and using imagination. Next is smallness. According to Griswold, more than adults, children are fascinated with the issue of size and particularly with smallness. When it comes to nature, anything is possible and miraculous. An example of smallness can be found in Charlotte's Web. Charlotte the spider is very small indeed, but very big in Wilbur's world because she saved his life by making these miraculous webs like Some Pig, Humble, and Terrific. This is my daughter's science project on grasslands when she was a 5th grader. She's 19 now, but she keeps this as a special reminder of what childhood truly means to her. Not only the smallness of the animals, but how very much alive they were to her, which is the next theme. Aliveness is a different entity between adults and children, in particular, talking to animals and toys. And Griswold argues that for the young, the whole universe is alive and full of companions. A perfect example of this is in Charlotte's Web, where Fern is sitting there talking and listening to all the animals on the farm: goose, gander, sheep, Templeton the rat, Wilbur the pig, and of course Charlotte the spider. Aliveness: to a magical, mystical mermaid, to a special friend that my mom gave to me when I was a little girl. Aliveness: something's wrong with this picture, but then again, that's what kids are for. Moving on to our final theme, lightness can be best described in children's literature as a temporary spell in which snugness, smallness, scariness, and aliveness alike can be incorporated with this theme. Griswold argues, compared to grown-ups, kids frequently seem lighthearted, while adults are more solid and serious and weighed down by responsibilities. When I think of this, I think of Peter Pan, a boy who never wanted to grow up. Another example of lightness is in Charlotte's Web, when after Charlotte dies and the following spring her babies, all 514 of them are born. As you can see here, one by one are climbing up to the top of the fence, stood on its head, and let loose of a cloud of silk, and it formed a balloon rising into the warm air. My son Ben, the artist superhero, his smile radiates everyone that's near him and brings out the lightness in me. So there you have it, the 5 important themes in popular and classic works of children's literature. But there's more to it than that. Do you recall my second question? Are children filled with sin? Absolutely not. But children are often othered, not in children's stories, but in real life. But for now, we'll get some more answers as we take a brief look at the history of children's literature. Children's literature still is relatively a new kind of literature. Before 1850, books taught lessons on manners and morals. Books also contain lessons on ideas of history and science that existed at that time. However, they found the books to be so dull, so they read stories intended for adults. You can see the examples there, which is kind of ironic because a significant aspect of children's literature is that it is written by adults. Children are characters in the book, but whose childhood does the book represent? Is it a real childhood or is it a theoretical one? When one group constructs another, then power becomes an issue. For much of the children's literature, the child is actually voiceless. I disagree, and because they are not voiceless, they are othered. For instance, in Charlotte's Web, Fern's mother, Mrs. Arable, has a problem with her daughter talking with animals, and you can see her discussing this with Dr. Dorian on the next picture, in which he actually sides with Fern. You can pause if you like to read what's happening between the two as they're discussing this problem. Fern's mother argues that this type of behavior that Fern is doing is not normal. Another example of a child being othered is in Sendak's 1963 popular Where the Wild Things Are. It was controversial, warning parents not to buy the book. Reason being is because Max's dreamlike foray entering to a world where the monsters are would scare children to death. Not only that, but the fact that Max's rebellion against adult authority was psychologically harmful. Sendak's book won the Caldecott Medal in 1964. Upon receiving this medal, this is what he had to say in his defense. Sendak argues, there are games children must conjure up to combat an awful fact of childhood, the fact of their vulnerability to fear, anger, hate, frustration, all emotions that are an ordinary part of their lives and that they can perceive only as ungovernable and dangerous forces. To master these forces, children turn to fantasy, that imagined world where disturbing emotional situations are solved to their satisfaction. It is my involvement with this inescapable fact of childhood, the awful vulnerability of children and their struggle to make themselves king of all wild things, that gives my work whatever truth and passion it may have. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Shanna Hartman. She teaches young adult literature at Gardner-Webb, and she provides an excellent example from a historical perspective of why children are being othered.
I think children continue to be more othered than maybe they were historically. And what I mean by that is I think, especially thinking about the innocence, I don't know that we always looked at children historically as so innocent. I think we try to preserve that more now, and you can kind of contemplate on that. And I think one of the ways we do that is by one, we teach them or allow them to read what's marketed to them. And so when you look back at the history of children's, of what we read to children or what we showed children to read or taught them, used to read, historically, it was moral tales. And it was how to be a good kid and sometimes a good person. And sometimes to tell those moral, so what's at the end, the moral of the story, you had to tell kind of a scary, something bad had to happen. Right. In order to get across.
Children are often othered not only because of their innocence and littleness, which can be defined both their physical and mental experience in the world, but they lack knowledge in their world and life experience, making them vulnerable to exposure and less effective than adults. In other words, youthfulness, unfortunately, is a disadvantage to children. In life, however, we have to grow up. My daughter is now 19 and is no longer into these themed experiences that my son is now experiencing. Her spell has been lifted, and that's okay, because growing up is a part of life. But so is the specialness of childhood. My son, however, who is 12, is still enjoying his magic moment of childhood, something as we adults take for granted. I do not know when my son's spell of childhood will be lifted, but when he knows, I will certainly know. I am grateful for this experience of learning about children's literature because I now have a great appreciation for understanding the magic and the importance of childhood. The captured images of their magical space is forever embedded in my heart, and looking at these images certainly brings out the kid in me. Thank you.